Exercise 17 deals with the brain and the spinal nerves. We're going to look at the brain first, and then we'll look at the cranial nerves that are associated with it. In the adult brain, the regions of the brain can be divided into 4 groups or 4 parts. The cerebrum, which is going to contain the majority, about 80% of the mass of the brain. The diencephalon, which composes the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the pineal gland, the cerebellum, and then the brainstem. And the brainstem is going to be composed of the midbrain, the pons, and medulla oblongata. The cerebrum, as I just said, is the most prominent or largest portion of the brain. This is where a lot of our cognitive functions are, our interpretation of different sensations that are coming in, intellectual thoughts, some of your memories, emotions are involved here. And what is colored in kind of the orangish color, as you can see, is one of the cerebral hemispheres. There's 2. There's a right and a left division for the cerebrum. You'll notice that the cerebrum has ridges and grooves, and some grooves are shallow, some are deeper, and of course we're going to give them different names. So gyri are the ridges, sulcus is a shallow groove, and if it's a deep groove, it's called a fissure. The lateral sulci here is highlighted with the orange color. Remember, your terms will help you with the location of it. Excuse me. The central sulcus, as you can see as well, and then the longitudinal fissure. The corpus callosum, these are the nerve fibers that are connecting the left hemisphere with the right hemisphere. So there is a connection between the 2 hemispheres. And this is showing a lateral view as well as a frontal view. And once again, this is the corpus callosum. Each of the hemispheres is divided into 5 different lobes. Excuse me. There is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Those 4 you should be able to easily locate by their names, and you can easily see them on either on a, say, a sheet brain or on a diagram, on the picture. The insula is the one that sometimes people have problems with. It's more internal. And so you can see on the bottom right picture, the highlighted orange there, that would be the insula lobe. The gray matter versus the white matter in the cerebrum. The gray matter is found in the cerebral cortex, meaning more on the surface, and then the white matter is deep to that, more interior. Keep this in mind because this is different than what we will see with the spinal cord. Now, there are some regions of gray matter that is deep, embedded within the white matter, that are known as the basal nuclei. So on the left side of the screen, in the orange coloration, you can see highlighted the gray matter, what would be the gray matter. And then on the right side of the screen, it would be the white matter. So once again, gray matter is on the surface, or the cortex area, and then the white matter is deep to that, or interior. Still talking about the cerebrum, the fornix is the area that links the different parts of the limbic system together. The limbic system is going to be involved with part of our emotions. The diencephalon, one of the components of that is the thalamus. The thalamus is going to be essentially a relay station. It's helping, as impulses come in, to relay them to the appropriate portions, typically in the cerebrum. And they're also going to help it regulate certain activities, emotions, memory, things like that. And in lecture, you'll be discussing in a little more detail what the various components or regions of the brain, what their functions are. The pineal gland is a small little gland and is part of the endocrine system, which you will be studying in A&P 2. For now, know that it's on the posterior end of the thalamus. It's very important in terms of the hormone that it secretes is melatonin that plays a role with our sleep, wake cycles, the day-night cycles. The hypothalamus, this also is where you're going to see some components play a role in multiple systems. So the hypothalamus is a huge player in the nervous system, but just so you're aware, it's also part of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus is going to play a huge role in helping to maintain homeostasis. It's kind of the regulator. It does produce some hormones, and it's going to be directly involved with the pituitary gland because a lot of the hormones that it produces, it will then send to be stored in the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, which is connected to the hypothalamus by the inframedullum, it also produces several hormones itself. It's going to be involved with helping to regulate certain things like water balance, lactation, but it's also some of the hormones that it produces will stimulate additional hormones in other glands to be secreted. So it's kind of like a chain reaction. The mammary bodies, there's two of them, they are paired. They also act as relay stations with the olfactory, which is sense of smell. You also have, as you can see highlighted in the yellow, the olfactory bulbs as well as the olfactory tracts, which are receiving that stimulus and then sending it to the appropriate region of the brain for interpretation. The optic nerves are receiving the impulses from the eyes, and the optic nerve is going to cross over in an area that's called the optic chiasm. And then the optic tract sends that information once again then to the appropriate region of the brain. With the brainstem, you have the midbrain. That is at the base of the cerebrum. And there's like four groups or four little spheres of tissue that's known as the corpora quadrigenum. You have within that the superior colliculi and then the inferior colliculi, which is involved with both visual and auditory reflexes. So as you can see here, another component of the brainstem will be the pons. It also acts as part of the relay station, sending information coming up from the spinal cord to the appropriate area in the brain. And then the medulla oblongata is the lowest part of the brain that's connected directly to the spinal cord. So it's also helping with relay. And the medulla also contains some of your control centers regulating respiration rates, heart rate, blood pressure. So, the cerebellum is receiving information from sensory. It also is very important in helping to regulate or with your perception of your orientation. So it's getting information from skeletal muscles and joints that's allowing you to be able then to interpret, am I standing up straight? Am I slumped over? Am I lying down? So you know the positioning of your body relative to your environment. Part of this is going to involve voluntary movements. Some of it is involuntary movements. And it's kind of helping to coordinate so you have a nice smooth movement when muscles contract. In the cerebellum, once again, the cortex is going to be the gray matter. One thing that's very unique to the cerebellum is the white matter. As you can see in this picture, it looks like a branching tree, like you have a trunk and then the branches and then the smaller twigs. And so the white matter is called the arbor vitae. It's very distinctive. The brain and spinal cord are going to be covered by connective tissue, and there's multiple layers of this connective tissue. It's for protection. And collectively, this is known as the meninges. So when it is covering the brain, we call it the cranial meninges. When it's covering the spinal cord, we call it the spinal meninges. There's three different layers. There's the Dura Mater, the Arachnoid Mater, and the Pia Mater. And like I said, this is going to help protect. In this diagram, you can see that the outermost is the Dura Mater. So you're going to have on the brain, you've got your scalp. Then you've got the bone. Then you're going to have the Dura Mater. The middle layer is the arachnoid layer, and then the innermost layer is the Pia Mater, and that's going to be attached directly to the brain itself. There is space between these layers, so the orientation of it would be your Dura Mater, which for the cranial meninges is actually subdivided into two smaller layers. So you have the Dura Mater, then the space beneath that is subdural space, then the arachnoid mater, then you have the subarachnoid space, that's where the cerebral spinal fluid is going to be, then you have the pia mater, and then you have the brain itself. If you do a dissection, say a sheep brain dissection, oftentimes the brains have the Dura Mater still attached to it, and it just, as you can see in this picture, it actually looks like this white little membrane, and that's what it is that's covering it. So you can easily see it. The cranial nerves, there are 12 pairs of the cranial nerves. The cranial nerves themselves are part of the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is just the brain and spinal cord. So the peripheral nervous system has to be attached to the spinal or the brain itself, to the central nervous system, because there has to be communication. So the cranial nerves, yes, are attached to the brain, but they're technically part of the peripheral nervous system. I said there's 12 pairs of them. Some of them contain just sensory information, meaning it's just bringing information to the brain itself. Some of them are mixed, meaning it has both sensory and motor nerves to it. So some of the nerves are bringing the information towards the brain. Some of it is sending that motor information away from the brain for the response. With the cranial nerves, 11 of the pairs are innervating or receiving stimuli from structures in the head and the neck. There's only one, the vagus nerve, which actually extends down to the thorax and the abdomen. Do you have to know the names and the number and the functions of them? Yes, you do, but don't panic, because oftentimes the names are going to help you with that. We do use Roman numerals with the numbering system for it. Over on this diagram, on the right-hand side, you can see in the red blocks. If we start at the top, and that's the easiest way to learn it, is learn it in order. Filaments of you've got the olfactory nerve, which is number 1. Number 2 is the optic nerve. Number 3 is the ocular motor nerve. Number 4 is the trochlear nerve. Number 5 is the trigeminal nerve. Number 6 is the abducens. Number 7 is the facial. Number 8 is the vestibular coccylar nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve is number 9. Number 10 is the vagus nerve. Remember, that's the one that does extend down into the thoracic cavity as well as the abdominal pelvic. The accessory nerve is number 11, and the hypoglossal nerve is number 12. So you notice the first 6 are in the red blocks on the right-hand side, and 7 through 12 are over on the left-hand side. Different people have different ways of remembering them, and so these are several different ways that people have come up. Find what works for you. Like I say, you do have to know the nerve, you do have to know the number, and the general function of them. CSF is cerebral spinal fluid, and this is fluid that basically is bathing the brain and the spinal cord to help protect it. helps protect it. It's a cushion. It's kind of like a shock absorber. So it helps physically protect it. It also can help with, from an immunological standpoint, there can be macrophages in it to help prevent infection. It is going to be produced by the choroid plexus, which tends to line these cavities where the fluid is and it's flowing. There are ventricles or cavities, they're interconnected, that the fluid, there's a set pattern that it flows through. Here you can see the 4 different chambers. There's the lateral ventricles, the 3rd ventricle, the mesencephalic aqueduct, and then the 4th ventricle. And then it will continue to flow through, also continues with the spinal cord through the central canal. The septum pellucidum is going to be dividing the lateral ventricles. Some clinical correlations: Parkinson's disease. We don't know exactly how this disease develops. There are certain things that can put you at increased risk. What happens is, even when you're at rest, there are muscle tremors or shaking that involves because the muscles are contracting. You normally would have control over these muscle contractions because it's skeletal muscles, it's voluntary. However, an individual who has Parkinson's disease starts to lose that control of those voluntary movements. Dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter, we have found that the production that is decreased in individuals with Parkinson's disease. So you can, as a form of treatment, administer L-Dopa, which is a precursor to making the dopamine, to try to increase the levels. Seasonal affective disorder, otherwise known as SAD, is another type of clinical disorder. That pineal gland that's producing the melatonin and is involved with your sleep-wake cycles is responding to dark and light hours. During the winter, when it's darker for longer periods of time, the melatonin production tends to increase. And what we've found is when melatonin increases, it tends to disrupt your normal sleep patterns, and it may also be involved with mood changes. So it has been studied, and it is established this is an actual disorder. There are some individuals who, if they go through several periods with, say, minimal light, they can start to get depressed. I've seen this personally with a roommate of mine that I had that when we lived in the Pacific Northwest, she would be perfectly fine, but if it was cloudy, even just for 3 days in a row, I would start to notice a change in her. In 4 days, if it continued on, there was a definite mood change. She would get very depressed. In some areas, especially way up north, where in the winter they have these long, long hours of darkness. One thing they have noticed, in some cities there's a higher rate of suicide, and it can be associated with this disorder. And the way different communities have learned to kind of try to combat it is in the wintertime in northern Alaska, there are areas where they have 23 hours of darkness. So the way they combat it is they will provide or have excessive street lights and keep those on during the day to try to simulate longer periods of light hours. With the cerebral spinal fluid, earlier I mentioned that in the subdural space, that's between the Dura Mater and the arachnoid mater. Above that is the epidural space, space between the Dura Mater and the bones. Both of those areas have very good blood supply. So if the blood vessels are somehow damaged, any fluid in this area is going to start to create pressure. That needs to be dealt with immediately because that extra pressure from that extra fluid buildup does put pressure on the brain then. And so if you catch it soon enough, you can actually treat it and drain the fluid. If it's there for too long, though, it can cause permanent damage to the brain because of that extra pressure being pushed upon it. Hydrocephalus is where too much cerebral fluid is being produced and it's not draining. There may be a blockage. There may be, for whatever reason, a reduction in the drainage. It could be due to infection, or it could be due to a tumor. Meningitis, anything ending with itis means inflammation. So meningitis is an inflammation of these meninges. It can be caused either by virus or bacterial infection. This needs to also be treated right away because if you're blocking the flow of that cerebral spinal fluid, obviously, once again, just like if you have a brain bleed, is that you're putting extra pressure on that brain. If this occurs in newborns and infants, because your cranial bones are still developing, they will often become much larger than normal. How do you treat it? Once again, you need to be able to drain that fluid, and so they'll often put a shunt in.